Hey everyone, this is Jim Fitzmaurice from DLT Solutions, bringing you another episode of the ContinuousX podcast series, presented by myself, Michael Fitzurka, and Rick Stewart from DLT Solutions. Very excited today. We have Ron, who is a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. For the past 17 years, Ron has focused on the areas of information security and risk management while leading the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, implementation project, which includes the development of security standards and guidelines for the federal government, contractors, and the United States critical information infrastructure. Earlier this year, Ron made the pivot to lead NIST's latest effort to develop a DevSecops framework at the organization, similar to their cybersecurity framework he helped create and stand up. We are very excited to speak with Ron today about his newest project and shift towards DevSecops. Ron, appreciate you joining us today, and I will just add, we did get the green light to call you Ron and not Dr. Ross, so appreciate that. For those of you that are listening and wondering why I'm referring to you as Ron. So thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here, Jim. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and let me dive right into things here, Ron. So, many in the industry consider you to be the godfather of cybersecurity and specifically NIST 800-53, going on something like 17 plus years. Question for you, why the shift to application software development, DevSecOps, and why now?
Well, there's an awful long history of cybersecurity, as you know. I think I've been doing it for 30 years now, and the actual profession goes back probably 4.5 decades now. So when we first started the FISMA project, the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2003, we had done several standards and guidelines up to that point, but this was our first big splash into the world of FISMA. And we were tasked with building a complete set of standards and guidelines that could help federal agencies comply with the legislation, all the requirements, the security requirements. And that's really where 800-53 was born, circa around 2005. We had a series of publications. There were a couple of FIPS and our security control catalog. And the risk management framework was one of the early publications. And all of that, we started really from ground zero. The security control catalog is important because it provides kind of the fundamentals across all the different aspects of security, confidentiality, integrity, availability, across management controls, operational controls, and technical controls. And we've got now in 853 revision 5, which is coming out shortly, 20 different families of controls. And this has been kind of my life's work for the past 17 years. And as soon as 853 Rev 5 is finalized, and within the next month or two, that's when I'll be officially going over to the engineering side, security engineering side. And I think the reason you asked why now, cybersecurity is a very comprehensive discipline. We're working with very complex systems. And we talk about security in two different contexts, looking at things above the waterline and below the waterline. That's a metaphor I use to indicate what things can you control as a customer or a user. Those are the things above the waterline. So you can do two-factor authentication, you can use encryption, you can write incident response plans, and all of that's under the customer's control. But there's a whole world below the waterline in what I call the system stack. When you move from applications to middleware to operating systems down to firmware, integrated circuits, now to the network. All of that work below the waterline, that's where industry really has a big part. And being able to define good security requirements and controls that can be built into products, systems, and services, that's really the future. And there's a lot of work going on now in DevSecOps, which is going to help that process move along more quickly. And that's really why I'm doing the pivot. We have a lot of engineering publications that we've already created, but I'm going to get a chance now to focus on the engineering, the security engineering work, which will include the DevSecOps.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Really appreciate that. And I'll pivot here based on that. to Rick and Mike here, from a DLT perspective, with our secure software factory, in and around that, we're attempting to address governance and compliance controls. Can you guys speak to the various components within the secure software factory and how they relate?
Sure. I'll take the first crack at this, Mike, and then you follow up. So, Dr. Ross, we had a preliminary discussion about what the secure software factory is in the previous podcast. I kind of showed the reference architecture on what we're trying to achieve with the secure software factory. And primarily, we're trying to address what you're trying to address at a holistic level. We're trying to address above the waterline, to use your metaphor, where workloads are being deployed in many different fashions, many different languages, many different architectures, microservices, traditional workloads, etc. And also using Polyglot to have the ability for developers to take their choice of languages and frameworks that best meets the need of the agency, of the customer, etc. But we're also trying to encompass all the security controls that need to be inserted into that framework, regardless of the language you're using, regardless of what type of middleware you're trying to accomplish. So we look at the secure software factory from the PaaS portion up. We believe very heavily on the Kubernetes platform. We believe it's a nice abstraction layer that allows workloads to be deployed across the heterogeneous environment, and also into environments that are disconnected, air-gapped, etc. It allows for that seamless moving and porting of workloads across environments. So when we look at the public sector at large, we're trying to embrace all the different aspects of what a public sector agency might have. They might have on-prem workloads. They might have a private cloud. They might have a public cloud, or they may have all the above in a hybrid environment. So we're trying to establish a layer that allows these workloads to be built in a ubiquitous way so that we can move them around based on need and based on security concerns and risk management, as you alluded to. Now, more importantly, we believe in containers, and we believe the ability to move these around are essential when we're trying to guide agencies on how to modernize their workloads. But at the same time, we're taking into account there are strict compliance and governance factors that your agency and your group is dedicated to make sure that these controls, these best practices are followed regardless of the type of technology you're using. The secure software factory is the manifestation of how we can still do work in an agile fashion using technology to expedite and accelerate your ability to get workloads out there faster, to give DevSecops cultural viewpoints into the workloads and the pipelines and the workflows that allow these organizations to work in a collaborative manner, but still respecting the controls and the security compliance regulations that are just part of normal software development. So we're seeing that as part of our goal with the Secure Software Factory, and aligns very much with your organization to ensure that as you're developing software, you're not missing out on all these controls and all these compliance measures. And Fitz, I don't know if you want to just add on to that.
Yes, sure. I think you touched on it with the fact that each agency is different and they have different concerns, and sometimes they're air-gapped. And so one of the thoughts around our factory, it's not just a product; it's a set of products. And we want to be highly configurable just to make sure that we can address any of the different concerns. And of course, everyone's got their own pet products that they want to use. And we're also, putting forth the principles of a secure software factory, or taking your software factory and securing it as well. So I think that all, the fact that we're adaptable and flexible is also part of our initiative.
Right. And it's the continuous nature. We're trying to automate everything so that these ATOs or getting through your CISO, et cetera, is not an onerous process. Once it's done and you learn from it and you continually move on, we want this to be repeatable so that the next deployment, the next enhancement, which could be in a day or whenever it's needed, it can be done quickly and with low risk. So, Dr. Ross, how is NIST adjusting, if at all, to the pace of this innovation and the impact of dynamic environments from cloud to containers to Kubernetes to hybrid solutions, everything that we mentioned as a factor in coming up with the secure software factory? How is NIST adjusting to that when you're seeing it from a meta layer?
Well, the good news is that our control catalog, and you brought up a couple of very important points in the last couple of minutes of discussion. Our control catalog has always been designed to be technology and policy neutral. And that's what allows us to do the things you just described. When you look at different security controls like access control mechanisms or encryption or INA mechanisms, those controls can be applied in any technology area. They just have to be sometimes tailored to the specific technology. I remember back when the Cloud First initiative first came on the scene in 2009. The first thing, this is before FedRAMP was even in existence. The first thing people asked is, where are all your cloud security controls? I said, well, you're looking at them. They're in 853. Right. It's just you have to apply them to cloud technology. And cloud technology, it was still a bunch of computers, lots of virtualization. So the good news is the fundamentals of cybersecurity haven't changed in 40 years. It's still about least privilege, least functionality, but we're now applying those controls, the management, operational, and technical, to the different technologies. So when you look at technical controls, and we've got 4 families of those controls that are kind of clustered, each of these things you described, whether it's Kubernetes or whether it's the container-based security, the things that Nick Shalane is working on in the Air Force, the idea is that we have to get away from looking at security as a static process and a compliance-based exercise. And this is why I'm so passionate about looking below the waterline, because now we're getting into architecture and engineering. And we're starting to have more serious discussions, which really industry has to be involved in because they're the ones that build the products and the systems and the services. And one of the great things that authorizing officials can get from this new way of thinking is that as you're building your products at DLT or any vendor, and you're using the secure software development framework or whatever best practices, secure coding techniques, there are decades of best practices on how to reduce weaknesses and deficiencies in code so those don't become vulnerabilities for customers on the other end, which many of those are impossible for us to deal with as customers. So the better work that you do on your end, the fewer things we're going to have to deal with on our end once we implement those products and systems and services. So it's a great way to do business. It's that abstraction layer that allows us to talk about controls. And then when you go below the waterline, you can see things like when you go through your software development lifecycle, you're looking at specific controls, specific security requirements as part of an architectural construct. Right. And what that allows us to do is that we don't have to have just that single dimension of penetration resistance, which we know can fail at times with very determined and sophisticated adversaries. And this is why we're pushing the 3-dimensional cybersecurity protection strategy of penetration resistance first. Keep doing everything you're doing. Cyber hygiene is good, but go to a second and third dimension of damage limiting architectures, which allows you to use virtualization techniques, the container-based security, and all of the things in the zero trust world that are coming online now. And that keeps the adversary off balance. They can get into your system, but once they're there, they have to understand the environment. They have to have time on target to carry out that attack sequence. And so we can become more agile and more nimble with dealing with those adversaries, and they will never win in those kinds of environments. So I applaud everything that your company and all the other companies are doing in this regard. And our job at the federal level is to make the federal customers more comfortable with these kind of environments, the new ways of doing business. And I believe it's going to absolutely give us better, stronger security going forward.
I agree. And this podcast is an example of ContinuousX. We also take the stance of this cannot be a once every month or once every 6 months deployment of a workload. This has to be continuous all the time in your pre-prod environment, looking for those attack vectors that you mentioned before, because the adversary is constantly looking. And when they find something, you can't wait a month or 6 months to patch that particular workload or your infrastructure, et cetera. It has to be continuously monitored, continuously. The ability to rectify it has to be quick.
Just think about this. What if we had a vision that someday we wouldn't really have to worry about all this antivirus software and all those kind of things? Right. You just say, whatever the adversary is going to throw at me, bring it on, because once they get into my environment, now they're in our house and we control the game at that level. And whether you're using virtualization techniques, micro-virtualization, or the zero trust architectures, you make it miserable for them to operate in that environment. And I think that would take a huge amount of pressure over trying to manage this threat space and always looking for that next threat. Those things are never going to end because the adversary is constantly morphing and changing their attack vectors and all the things that they can do. So we can respond and be smarter about this and not have to worry about those things. That would be my vision for the future.
That's an excellent point.
And hey, Ron, I just want to hop in here real quick. So a few weeks ago, we actually had the privilege to interview Nick and talk about the Platform One and what he's getting himself into, next steps, and what the future looks like for him. Curious to know, with the work that you and your team are doing currently with Nick and the Platform One team over there, and all the DoD stuff that they're driving right now. What is NIST doing from a Platform One standpoint to, support and potentially, create unique, similar to what the analogy you just gave of, hey, what the future holds. Is there anything you can talk about there?
Well, Nick is doing some really good work over in DoD, and right now we have lots of conversations. And from what NIST is, our perspective is, we would like to do many different things in the world of DevSecOps. We talk about a DevSecOps framework, and a framework is inherently general in nature. A good framework like the cybersecurity framework or the privacy framework or even the risk management framework, those frameworks are sufficiently general that allows every organization to use them, but customize them in a way that works for their organization. And so the same thing would be true with DevSecOps. Right now, we're doing a lot of research and just investigation, looking at what industry is doing in the world of DevSecOps. And that would include things the federal government is doing as well. And Nick he's a disruptor. Sometimes when you're out there on the point like that, you take all the shots because you're the first one through this new way of thinking. Right. And, some people agree with it and some people don't, but he's willing to take those kind of risks. And if you don't take risks, you don't have the great rewards. And so I really applaud him for what he's doing. We're watching what Platform One is doing very closely. We're talking to industry. We are trying to learn about all the different innovative things that are going on right now. And my goal would be to, at some point within the next 12 months, to capture all of those best practices and put them into a DevSecOps framework that would allow us to normalize the language. So when you talk about DevSecOps, if you go up to 10 people, right now you probably get 10 different definitions of what DevSecOps really is. And so just like the cybersecurity framework and our software secure development framework, they normalize the language and the discussion. So you two organizations can be talking about DevSecOps and have a relative understanding of what that really means and how it can benefit them. And the big point there is we don't ever want to limit the flexibility or the innovation of industry, because that's the engine that makes all this stuff work. And so, if we can make it easier for federal customers and our private sector customers as well, who use all of the same technologies, make it easier for them to understand what they're getting, why it's important, and how it makes their missions and their business more secure. And if we can do that, I think that would be a home run, and that would be my goal for the future.
I wanted to touch back on a couple points you were making that there isn't really a new problem in the security world in the last 40 years, but the approach certainly has changed with where it used to be trust but verify. The zero trust model is never trust and always verify. And I was wondering how you could maybe apply that beyond the network protocols of zero trust to a more cloud native software development or to the elements of the software supply chain itself. Do Do you have thoughts on how that can be accomplished?
Well, the supply chain is a huge problem because we are totally dependent on technology today for everything we do in our most critical systems. And so I use the metaphor of the black box. I've done several presentations recently where I talk about the black box, and that's really a metaphor for the system stack. Everything inside that computer could be a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, a supercomputer. The common denominator is it's all computers driven by software and firmware. And the trustworthiness of that black box is really important. We have to understand to some degree that the people who are building that software and the hardware and the firmware and putting those systems together, they have some sense what it means to have trustworthiness in those systems and components. Because we have to understand that they can't fail at inopportune times. Because we're not just talking about the blue screen of death that we talked about a couple of decades ago. We're talking about these components, and I'm talking about the entire space of IoT, the Internet of Things. I'm talking about the massive convergence of cyber and physical systems where computers are everywhere now. They're controlling not just the entertainment system in your automobile, they're controlling the critical safety systems, medical devices. And these things can have life-threatening implications if we don't get this problem right. So having best practices, and it's always two sides of the same coin when you're talking cybersecurity. One side of the coin is a set of requirements. Here's what I want you to do as far as security goes, the protections, the controls. The other side of the coin is, how do I know you did what you were supposed to do? That gets more into the notion of assurance.
Right.
So on one side, it's more functionality, security functionality. On the other side, I really want to be able to trust that you did the right thing. Now, it's certainly the average customer out there doesn't have the ability, or should they need to, understand all the details of what's in the black box. But the great thing about DevSecops is that when you start building security into the life cycle, early and throughout the life cycle, and you're going through your normal development processes, and we characterize these in 800-160, our systems security engineering guideline. At each one of those steps, there's security considerations. And that would include what you do in the sense of capturing the stakeholder requirements, the security requirements. How do those requirements then push into the system? Mm-hmm. And then there's an architecture, a design phase, and an integration, and a transition to the operations side. And then that cycle is kind of continuous. Yep. And within that, you've got a good amount of verification and validation, which means verification. Did I build the widget correctly? Mm-hmm. Did I use best practices? Validation is the widget fit for purpose? Does it really help me do my mission activities or my business operations? And those are two very important parts of this assurance component that we talk about. And what would be fantastic is if we could capture the developers' evidence that they are going through the routine process of testing and evaluation, whether it's regression testing, static and dynamic analysis, all those tools that good software developers have. If we could capture that evidence in the development process, which I believe they're already doing, and use that to convey that to their customers. I'm not saying give away all your IP, but there has to be some middle ground where you can show we have an outstanding development process. We follow the SSDF or whatever your best practices are. And we've captured the evidence that shows you that we've actually done that. And we're willing to share some of that with you to gain that confidence. It's kind of like an automobile. I don't test and evaluate my car. They don't ask me to put my own airbag in. They do that at the factory. There is some degree of regulation in the auto industry, but there's just a whole bunch of car companies wanting to bring safer cars to their customers. And that becomes a competition amongst the different automobile manufacturers. You know, you can see this over the last 3 decades where you went from seat belts, which my first car barely had, to airbags, to steel reinforced doors. The engine compartments drop down. Now you have all those safety sensors. And there's like a series of competitions within the industry to make those cars really safe for their customers. And I would love to see that same competition within our software industry, because most of our security problems can be solved with good software development. There's always the operational and the management side of the house, but we can handle those. It's the technical side that we really want to focus on.
So, Ron, I have a quick follow-up to that because it's a perfect analogy you just used. And I wanted to ask this, tying kind of back to the Platform One discussion. and I'm sure that you saw it over the last few weeks, how the Army rolled out, I think it's Austin, Texas, that they're standing up their own software factory now. And I believe the Navy also has the intention here in the very near future to stand up their own. And it looks like they're going to be somewhat similar to Platform One, right? And everyone knows there's always that competitive spirit between, those guys on the DoD side. My question is specifically what you were just talking about, right, is the car analogy and having a overarching security model that oversees that. With the work that you're doing now and the groundwork that you're laying and the pivot towards DevSecops, is the work that you guys are doing looking long term, that you guys want to have guidelines, controls, etc., for all of those various factories that are out there and try to get them on the same page? And I would also say, as a follow-up to that, is in your previous role, the work that you've been doing the last 17 years and around the cybersecurity element, how do you get, both industry and, internally in the government, folks to buy into and adhere to those guidelines that you and your team are putting out there? Because I can only imagine that has to be a challenge.
Well, this goes back to a leadership question. It's all about leadership, and I think you have to always start with a great vision. Where do you want to see things go? And the power of the vision and passion and being able to convince people and explain what you're trying to do. The vision that I would have is a DevSecops framework that does a lot of the same things that the cybersecurity framework does. It starts out with those high-level functions and then moves down hierarchically to categories and subcategories of cybersecurity considerations, and then eventually ends up with a series of choices at the bottom of that tree that relate to 5 different security control sets that people could choose. If you're in the electric sector, you're going with the NIRC-CIPs. You may be following ISO 27001/2. You may be using the NIST controls. You may be using the Center for Internet Security controls. But the unifying factor is the framework, which allows everyone to have a common conversation, understanding what we're talking about. We would never want to force industry to do anything because industry is the engine of creativity. And so, it's great that the Air Force and the Army are standing up these factories, but I think the ultimate win is when you get government, industry, and academia all kind of reading from the same page. Right. We all understand what the common goals and objectives are. We're gonna use our competitive juices to bring those different solutions to the table, but they can be consistent. So when you look at security controls in the cybersecurity framework, those same controls could be reflected in a DevSecOps framework, and all that would do is say, look, if you're going through a lifecycle development process, here's some things to consider in these different areas that will help make that product, that component, that system, that service more secure for your customers. How you do that and how you apply those controls, much like we do with cloud and mobile, that's up to industry. And the important part there is that it's all about transparency and traceability, because transparency and traceability allow us to have greater trust in those things that we're using. And I think that's the big missing piece right now. Most customers don't have a clue about what industry is doing. There's a tremendous opportunity for the folks who are building the great products and systems and services to tell their customers, here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. Here's why our product is more secure than our competition down the street. And if you can do that, that's what we call a win-win. It's a win for the customers and it's a win for the producers of the technology. And when you get to that point, you're really off and running in a big way.
Can you speak to the role that NIST plays as it relates to the cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC criteria? And what do you think CMMC's impact on DevSecOps is, if any?
Well, that's a great question. CMMC, as you know, has been under development by the DoD for the past year and a half or so under Katie Arrington. Mm-hmm. And it actually has its roots that go way back before the CMMC was even a 4-letter buzzword. We started back in 2015 with a collaborative project with the Defense Department and the National Archives and Records Administration. And our intention there was to provide a set of security requirements that could protect controlled unclassified information. And that requirement came from an executive order that started way back in 2010 and had a lot of years of kind of spin up. But we eventually produced the Special Pub 800-171. It was 110 security requirements that were needed to protect controlled unclassified information when it was on the non-federal side. So we have our own set of controls and the things from 853 where federal agencies they're required to implement the moderate baseline of protection for anything related to CUI. But when that information goes over the fence into non-federal organizations or non-federal systems, we still want that same or a similar level of protection because the information doesn't lose value just because it goes from our side to their side. Right. That was the birth of the 171. And then what happened a couple of years ago, there have been several really devastating cyber attacks on the defense industrial base. And what we discovered is that those 110 requirements, they're good, but for sophisticated high-end adversaries that are throwing their best stuff, they're well-resourced, they're sophisticated, they've got these constant barrage of cyber attacks, and they're going after not always the big guys, the big five defense contractors, but there's a long and deep supply chain those contractors use. And so one of the tricks of the adversaries, they go after sometimes the weakest link in the supply chain. That could be a very small mom and pop company producing cutting edge technologies or ideas that are going to mature over the life cycle and eventually work their way into a critical weapon system or something else. And so that spawned the development of another NIST special publication. It originally started out to being SP 800-171 Bravo, but people were confusing that with the 171, so we changed the number to 800-172. And that's a set of enhanced security requirements for protecting CUI, but those requirements would only be applied on a contract-by-contract basis when you're dealing with high-value assets or critical program information, such as you might find in a subset of the DoD's overall contracts and programs. And so those two publications really became the foundation for the CMMC. Now, the CMMC also uses other standards and guidance documents that have been brought in from various different places. They cover both functionality and assurance. There's some maturity model type things in there as well. And it's organized according to 5 levels. So the basic concept there is that one size doesn't fit all. You've got hundreds and thousands of contractors in the defense industrial base. They're all working on different things, and the level of protection needed for those different contracts or different things that they're being worked on may be different. And so that's what was the evolution of the CMMC. So NIST's role, we didn't have any direct role in the development of the CMMC, but our 2 publications are kind of the engine, which is the vast majority of the requirements in the CMMC. And I think the other thing I would say is that they were also trying to solve a problem of, we talked about the coin, 2 sides of the coin. Yeah. Side 1 has the requirements, and side 2, how do I know that the contractor or the external organizations are satisfying those requirements? Those could come out of 171, 172, or anything else in CMMC. And so the concept of the independent third-party assessment organizations, which was a primary objective of the FedRAMP program, where the cloud service providers implemented the FedRAMP controls, but those controls were verified and validated by the independent 3 PAOs, third-party independent assessment organizations. And that, again, goes back to this notion of assurance. You have an external party making sure that the cloud service providers do what they were supposed to do. And that same concept is now being pushed out into the CMMC world. So you don't just rely on self-assessments anymore. You've got a third party going in there and trying to confirm to the best of their ability. How does it relate to DevSecOps? We still have a problem there because security assessors, control assessors, have the same problem that the rest of us have when it comes to the black box. You all know in your company that when you're developing software, there are certain types of testing called black box testing, gray box testing, and white box testing. And it all depends on how much access you have to the internals of that software. If I'm doing a black box test, I just give it a stimulus and I get a response and I can see if it meets that particular requirement. But security goes well below that waterline. It has to do with how the software is designed, the interfaces between modules, and all of that requires access to the internals of the software development organization. And that's why common criteria evaluations look a lot deeper than just this external security control assessor type of assessment. So I think the DevSecOps world can still provide a tremendous amount of value, because when you bring forward all the evidence that you're producing for that software product and you make it available, that can be given to those external assessors, because they're never going to be able to get down below the waterline and do the things that you do in the actual development process when you're doing those specific types of regression testing, dynamic and static analysis, and things that require access to the code, to the design documentation, all of that. So I think there's a very nice complementary aspect of everything going on with CMMC, and we should not do one or the other. We should do all the above to make our lives a lot more transparent and get greater assurance in all the things that are going into our critical systems.
And Ron, I'll just quickly add, and Rick and Mike, I'll toss this one over to you guys, because Ron touched on it, is part of our secure software factory that we've put together. When we were first kind of back of napkin that idea, Ron, and when we were looking at industry, specifically the major system integrators, one of the things that we were looking and seeing and noticing from a trend standpoint is that testing piece, right? And we made that a key part of our software factory because, and Rick, I'll segue to you here. We've been downtown multiple times where we have heard, whether fireside chat, panel side chat, and agency executives talking about that black box that is testing, and that it is a critical piece of DevSecOps. And some would argue you can't do DevSecOps without testing.
Well, I would agree, Jim. And just to pull on that thread a little bit, there are a lot of factories and other either SIs promoting their factories. And what Jim and I have noticed is they're always a little bit more quiet on the testing aspect. A, because I think it's very, very difficult to do. And B, a lot of the SIs use that as their secret sauce as to how they're testing. From our standpoint, we're trying to bring that forward as this is a key element. This is a key activity that has to be not only pulled behind the curtain so that everyone can see and contribute to it and can visualize how it's being tested, and where it's deficient, add testing onto that, whether you're a security expert, a network expert, storage expert, etc. We have to have visibility into those test cases so that we can improve on the process. And that's where I think we have differentiated ourselves with our secure software factory, is we're making that a first-class citizen, and nothing about open source or secret sauce. We're trying to promote products that bring that forward, provide profiles that conform to the NIST controls, etc., so that we can keep innovating and bringing that forward. Because without it, you cannot accelerate your ability to deliver software quickly.
Yeah, and
if I could just very quickly agree with what you're saying. A lot of these software developers or the system integrators, they're customers. They're actually importing components that they're going to bring together in their overall product. So they need to have that evidence and that assurance just as much as we do on the endpoints of these discussions. And I think that whole concept of transparency and producing evidence goes up and down the supply chain to the smallest producer of the smallest component, because they're going to try to be selling their particular pieces to those larger contractors who are going to be using all those different components. And so I think this concept really scales up and down and would be very beneficial for everyone to implement.
Yeah, it even goes lower to the development layer, that, you're not just writing all the code. You're using third-party applications or third-party libraries, and you need to, your code can be as secure as possible. But if some party element that you're using has a security flaw, then you're just as weak as that link. So you not only need to scan your code and provide, evidence of that, but you need to show what you're using and that they're secure as well. And we
Right.
toot our own horn, but we try to address that in our factory as well and collect that evidence. And we bundle things together into a sort of an ATO package at the end. But, we can go further with further security elements as well.
Also, the other thing that we, in our 800-160 publication, that was our first system security engineering guidance document. And we have it's kind of a metaphor it's called the system of interest. And inside that system, there are 1 to n different elements, system elements. And that really characterized what you just talked about is as you're building a system, you're going to be bringing in different software components, different pieces. And that engineering guidance allows you to understand what are those different system elements, how do they interact with each other, and you can start making design decisions. You may have a choice between, a trusted operating system and one that's not as trusted. And there may be good reasons why in certain circumstances you might use Windows. Other circumstances you might want to go for a highly assured operating system that meets some of the higher levels of the common criteria. But those are design decisions that the customer really is not involved in all the time, but you as a developer need to be able to make those kind of decisions with your eyes wide open. So I think it always gets back to, again, this notion of transparency.
Agreed. We're going to go down the DevSecOps channel again. Now, we've talked about compliance controls and best practices and technology, et cetera. That's 2 of the 3-legged stool for DevSecOps. The other part is people and cultural and how they interact. We can lead all these practices. We can bring them forth. We can make them mandatory. But the real accelerator to DevSecOps is how these groups of varied skill level people interact and work together. Now, in the public sector, what are your concerns, if any, when you have agencies moving towards this DevSecOps cultural movement, even embracing the technology? What advice can you provide to them to avoid pitfalls when it comes to collaboration or it comes to working well, not even across teams, but across companies potentially?
Well, I'm a strong believer in starting with small successes and building on those successes. I think this is one of the most difficult, and this may be our biggest difficult and challenging problem in the federal government. We're a pretty big bureaucracy. I know bureaucracy is not unique to the federal government, and sometimes you see it in the private sector as well, but changing culture has always been one of the most difficult. We've seen this with cloud computing. Right. It's taken a long time for the federal government to get comfortable with cloud computing. And it really gets down to understanding what things now can you send to the cloud, what things should stay back home. Right. But those are discussions that you should be comfortable having. So I look at our role at NIST is to try to set the tone for having this discussion. Mm-hmm. And being able to move the culture, but do it in a way that is not threatening. And you have senior leaders that have been doing the same things the same way for the past 10, 15, 20 years. And sometimes you have to show the value of something, but not just do it in one big bang. Agreed. And that's why I think you can take a lot of small efforts. And I think Nick is doing this in the Air Force. He's got a much bigger platform because he's the chief software officer for the United States Air Force. That's a pretty big job. But so he's starting with a pretty big platform. But he's actually going down the same type of road. He's showing the process. He's right. showing the outcomes of the process, and he's letting his customers speak for the value of that. And then he's taking that success and he's saying, okay, if we can do it for this, then why can't we do it for that? And then the right. next thing. And before you know it, you're taking those small successes and you're building momentum and inertia. And sometimes when that snowball starts to roll down the hill, halfway down the hill, it looks a lot different than it did at the top of the hill. And so that would be my advice to the federal agencies who are trying to move. Don't try to do everything at one time, but understand as much about DevSecOps as you possibly can first. It's always become grounded in the fundamentals. And then take those fundamentals and see how can we apply those to my organization. DevSecOps is not going to work well for every part of every organization,
Right.
but there's a place and a time and a purpose where it's going to work in a fantastic way. So find those places, and then don't be afraid to try new things. I mean, if you're so risk averse that you're never going to try new things, then we're never going to move forward in this space. And you can't operate with that mentality in a world that is looking at industry that is highly innovative. They bring together these teams of really bright, a lot of times they're young people, at least everybody looks young when you're from my perspective, but they're bright young people who want to try new things. They're looking for new solutions, and that is the way you get innovation. That's what happened with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs going back to the 1980s. They started in a garage, and now they dominate the industry. So I'm hoping that our small part in that is to be able to create a DevSecOps framework that allows that communication. So the folks who are in the trenches can say to their bosses, hey, NIST has got this new DevSecOps framework. Here's what it can do for us. And here's how it can work nicely with industry to give you the greatest technology to help you do your missions and your business functions even better than you're doing them today, making them more secure, and I would argue more cost effective in the long run. And that's a strategy that can win the hearts and minds of every senior leader in every federal agency.
I think that's a great answer, Ron. And I want to pull on that a little bit and just say, I love your analogy with the younger minds coming in and they're innovative and let's call it risk takers but you marry them with more traditional risk mitigated thought process to say, hey, we've been in this industry for a long time and these are the things that can come up and bite you. If we marry those two together and have them working collaboratively, that's when you're going to get a lot of the smaller projects saying, wow, that's really working well over there. They're in a framework, they're managing their risk, and they're being innovative at the same time. And that's where it's going to grab a lot of eyes and a lot of attention. And eventually, like you said, when you can show the cost-benefit analysis of having that kind of culture, that's where I think where it's just going to proliferate.
We did that with our 800-160 publication. When we started that project back in 2012, we could have said, we're going to develop a system security engineering guideline starting from our perspective as security engineers or security professionals. But what we did instead is we went out and looked for an international standard that was focused on systems engineering and software engineering. And I said, let's not try to push this security, rock up the hill again. Let's go to the people who actually build stuff. They're builders and they know what they're doing. They've been doing it a long time. Our part is to be able to take all 30 of those processes in the ISO standard 15288 and bring our 40 years of experience in the security world and show in each one of those processes what security considerations they might want to look at as they're building that system.
Right.
And that to me starts to look at it's not as threatening and saying, hey, we know all the answers and being arrogant about this thing. We start from a more humble perspective and say, here's what we think we can do to help you build a better system, better software. And I think that's a mind shift that has to occur within our security community. It may turn out that the better job that we do in helping to educate the system engineers and the software engineers in doing best practices, which they already know how to do, that may solve 90% of our security problems going forward. And we'll have to spend a whole lot less time with our hair on fire, always looking at that next threat or vulnerability, things that are going to constantly be escalating because of the complexity of the software and the systems we're building. That complexity is not going away, and we have to find better ways to deal with it on the front end of the life cycle and all the way through the life cycle.
Agreed.
I think you approach that through just constant automation or continuous automation. I should you plug our title, ContinuousX. That you're always, like you've mentioned about collecting the security output from your development process, and you would do that by automating it in your pipeline. And but there are a lot of regulations. There are a lot of compliances with names and numbers and that I'm not even aware of. I'm more of a developer. So I want to be, but I want to be compliant. I want my code at the end to pass all the security checks. So, is there a sort of and you also have to look at that each one of these, processes, and there's nothing out of the box that can, have all the controls necessary because each agency, each workload, each deployment could be a different thing. So is there not that all controls aren't, important and there for a reason, but is there a minimum set of controls that you can advise an agency to build into their automated process? Or what should they be targeting, to automate to get to that security nirvana?
Well, I don't think there necessarily is a security nirvana, it will always be a complicated problem. Unfortunately, we have over probably 12 or 1,300 controls in the latest revision 5 of 853. And we never expect anybody to implement all those controls. We try to organize them in what we call baselines, low impact, moderate impact, and high impact, which is kind of a triage. It characterizes things that could have impact on your organization. That impact could be low and virtually not affect many things, or it could be high impact, it could be catastrophic effects. And we've always started with the baselines and the concept of tailoring. You take that set of controls and you tailor. You can add controls, you can eliminate controls based upon your specific mission, environments of operation, technology you're using, like mobile or cloud. And that tailoring process has always been the ability for customers to still comply with FISMA and yet do it in a way that works for their organization. But it does take a lot of thought and analysis. It's not ever going to be just a trivial process. But I think where this can really catch fire and be much more productive and cost effective is when you have industry now that are recognizing a set of controls. You talked about what are the minimum controls that would go into a product. You can go back and I know the SANS Institute about maybe 15 years ago talked about the 20 critical controls, and there's lots of groups that have talked about kind of the minimum essential controls. That's not a bad place to start. There are certain things that will always be important, like when you're in an enterprise, understanding what components are on your network. Right. What kind of software updates have you done? Are you using the latest software? Have you done all your patches? Are you doing, are you encrypting data when it's at rest? And are you limiting the number of functions that are only mission essential? Are you limiting privileges to only those that are necessary to carry out the organization's missions and business operations? So there's all of those things are kind of running in the background all the time. And then you've got policies and procedures. So it really becomes a question of, we get back to the same aspect in industry. Whatever your product is, whether it's a database management system or a network device or some kind of a software application, there are best practices that you can look at. The OWASP, and there's so many organizations out there that have defined really are considered best practices for building software that has fewer weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And the subset of those weaknesses and vulnerabilities, if they're exploitable, turn into vulnerabilities. And so the same question always arises: if I can reduce the number of weaknesses and deficiencies as part of the normal development process, then those that do end up going to the customer are fewer in number. Mm-hmm. And those that can be exploited will be fewer in number, which translates to fewer vulnerabilities. And I don't think you're ever going to have a perfect situation, because complexity will not allow us to have perfection. But we can do a lot to improve the quality of the software and the components coming out of industry, and telling the customers how they did that. And then we can combine that with our three-dimensional aspects of protection, which would use the things on the architectural level of the zero trust architecture concepts, or the virtualization, micro-virtualization, micro-segmentation, again, which creates an environment that will be absolutely miserable for the adversaries to operate within. They may be able to get in, but they're not going to be able to hurt us in a way that can affect our missions and our business operations. And that translates eventually into the most important concept we call cyber resiliency and system resiliency. And it's a very simple concept. Can you take a punch and get up off the mat and continue to do your job? And that is what the task is in front of all of us to try to achieve. And again, it's not going to be easy, but the stakes could never be higher. Our economic security, our national security depend on our ability to innovate and bring cost-effective products, the best in the business, the best in the world to our customers, and do so in a way that preserves our security and our fundamental ideas of privacy. That's also important now in the world we're building. Those are really such critical concepts that go back to our Constitution. So we're trying to maintain all of those basic principles in a digital world, and we're still learning how to do that.
I would only add on, I love the resiliency, but my definition of resiliency is when you take that punch, to use your metaphor, you come back even stronger. And that's what we're trying to say is, learn from all of these things and now not only remediate, but now take the next step to see that it never happens again.
Anti-vulnerability, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This has been fantastic, Dr. Ross, Ron. We're in the lightning round now with our ContinuousX podcast. And this is something that's actually a quite interesting topic. So we'd like to pose this question to everyone we get onto these podcasts, because there is kind of behind the scenes kind of a argument with, is your preference DevOps or is it DevSecops or another Sec DevOps? Do you have a position?
No, I really don't. It sounds like a funny thing to be arguing about, but I've already seen this in the world of buzzwords. We spend so much time on creating the buzzword that we don't get on with business. So my preference would be, I've heard people say, we got to have Sec DevOps because Sec has to be right there in the front of everybody's mind. I say, well, what about putting it in the middle? That talks to the notion of integration in the middle of the development and the operation side. So I don't really think it makes a difference on what you call it as long as whatever we do call it. I think DevSecOps is going to become probably what ends up being the industry de facto standard of what we call it. But once we have that term, our job is to define really what it means and how different people can bring their own interpretation to it, but yet still maintaining the overall goals and objectives of what DevSecOps is intending to bring to both industry and to customers who are buying all of those great products that industry produces. So that's all I would say about that. It's not that's the least of our problems.
I will say that is the best answer that we've got. The first shot you took there, Ron, of the fact of fighting over something like this instead of working. That was a great response. So, Ron, last question. So, we end every podcast episode with this question. Again, very formal. Do not relate to business, professional. This is purely personal. If you could continually do one thing, what would it be?
On a personal basis, if I could continually do one thing, it would be eat less junk food and lose weight.
Nice.
But if I'm doing it in my professional capacity, I would continuously monitor and know what's on my system and my network, and to absolutely make sure that I was using the most current software that I possibly could, because that's where all the updates in security and privacy are coming from. And that technology refresh is really important today. So those two things, knowing what you're using and making sure whatever you do use, you have the most current copies possible, because that's going to reduce your susceptibility to some of these cyber attacks. It doesn't mean you don't do everything else, but if I had to just do those two things, that's what I would do.
Awesome. Well, Ron, thank you so much for participating in the DLT ContinuousX podcast series. Appreciate the time. Good luck in the new position, and best of luck in the future. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Ron.